If you love our podcast, then I suspect you will be super pleased to join us live. That's right, it's time for our annual No Small Endeavor Live Thanksgiving show. This year we'll be joined by New York Times bestselling author David Brooks with special guests Amy Grant and Sheryl Crow. It's a night of thoughtful conversation, moving music, and a room full of folks all in pursuit of no small endeavor. This year it's at the beautiful Schermerhorn Symphony Center here in Nashville, Tennessee. Mark your calendars for November 24. You will not want to miss this amazing night with some of our all-time favorite guests on the show. Don't wait. Go get your tickets now at nosmallendeavor.com. No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. What if comparing car insurance rates was as easy as putting on your favorite podcast? With Progressive, it is. Just visit the Progressive website to quote with all the coverages you want. You'll see Progressive's direct rate, then their tool will provide options from other companies so you can compare. All you need to do is choose the rate and coverage you like. Quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Hello, friends. Lee Seecamp. This is No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Russell Moore and David French. David is a New York Times opinion columnist. Russell is the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. Russell and David are certainly among the most either on the one hand loved and respected, or on the other hand denounced and unappreciated commentators on religion and politics. I've long respected and appreciated the integrity that they have brought to their work in the world and have been grateful for having conversations with them a number of times through the years and getting to know them both here in Nashville. It's a great conversation, very helpful, I think, about our current context. We're also discussing their recent project called The After Party, which is an attempt to reframe the ways in which we're having conversations about Christianity and politics. Enjoy. Russell Moore, editor-in-chief at Christianity Today, director of Christianity Today's Public Theology Project, was named in 2017 to Politico magazine's list of top 50 influence makers in Washington. Russell was president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention from 2013 to 2021. Prior to that role, he served as provost and dean of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, where he also taught theology and ethics. Welcome, Russell.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you. David French joined the New York Times as an opinion columnist in January 2023. Before that, he was a senior editor at The Dispatch, which he helped start, and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. David spent most of his career as a practicing lawyer, working in both commercial and constitutional litigation. In his late 30s, he joined the United States Army Reserve as a Judge Advocate General, was deployed to Iraq in 2007, for which he was awarded a Bronze Star. And in the interest of full disclosure, David is also these days one of my colleagues as a faculty member at Lipscomb University in Nashville, where we were both also undergrads. And if I remember correctly, lived in the same dorm for a while. Welcome, David.
In the same dorm. We were in the same social club, which is the Lipscomb version of fraternity.
Yes, all sorts of trouble we may have gotten into way back then. So, welcome. Glad to have both of you guys here with us today. So, for those who may not know kind of some of your story, how would you narrate challenges and change that you've weathered over the last decade, let's say? Can you kind of do that in any sort of brief, coherent narrative? Russell, you want to give that a shot?
Well, I think that part of it is the kind of shaking of everything that has happened in American life. So I think over the last 10 years, there were a lot of people who thought, okay, we're all together, we're doing the right thing. Here's this category in my tribe, and there's that group over there, and that's their tribe. And all of that has been remixed in a lot of ways. So the things that we thought would divide those categories aren't actually, turns out, what are the divisions now. Yeah. And so I'm somebody who grew up and lived in a denominational context, Southern Baptist context, very, very deeply embedded in that, and am no longer still an evangelical Christian, committed Christian, but not in my denominational home context. And a lot of issues that seem to be separate, but actually I think are related. So the politicization that's happening within the church right now and with other sectors of American life, racial justice questions, and sexual abuse questions. Those things, I think, are actually coming from much of the same source, and that has divided up a lot of the traditional alliances.
And then what is this? Can you give just a glimpse to folks of what this has kind of meant for you personally?
Well, it meant a kind of exile from, I really haven't changed in terms of my basic framework of what I think at all, but a lot of the people that I worked with and served with have changed, and now I'm a liberal in their minds, even though I hold the same views that I always did.
Yeah. David, how would you summarize kind of the last categories of the last decade?
Russell and I have lived parallel lives to an extent in different denominations. Mm-hmm. So I was 10 years ago in the PCA and felt like it fit me like a glove, to be frank. So I'm conservative politically, I'm conservative theologically, conservative culturally. I was what you might call a full spectrum conservative. And also I was a Republican. In 2012, I was a Romney delegate to the Republican National Convention. Gosh, I was Republican going all the way back to the Reagan days when I came of age as a Reagan conservative. And Lee, I think I was even on the right leaning side of Lipscomb, maybe politically, even when we were there back in 87. I was, I believe, a year after you. And so I felt very much at home. And then in 2015, Donald Trump comes down the escalator and everything changed. And no one was more surprised by this than me. And I feel like, ever since I've been thinking, what did I miss? I've been examining myself. What was I blind to? Was I the fish that didn't know it was wet and sort of swimming in a culture that was different than what I thought it was? But what I would say is very similar to Russell is I didn't change in my theology. I didn't change in my political point of view. I remained a committed civil libertarian dedicated to free speech. I remained a pro-life advocate. And also, very critically, this is something that never caused a problem in GOP circles before. I remained an advocate for the importance of character in public officials. Because to me, my political conservatism really had two components to it. It had a ideological component and a characterological component, so to speak. That in essence, what the United States, what's best for this country are people who are men and women of integrity, applying a particular ideology that I believed best reflects and would best lead to justice and human flourishing in the United States. But the integrity component was not optional. It was not optional. And so I will never forget, sort of sounding the alarm in late 2015, early 2016, appealing to documents and principles that had been clearly and unequivocally articulated during the Clinton era, and thinking I was going to get some sort of positive reception to it, and absolutely the opposite. Just absolutely the opposite. And then it's only gotten worse since. And what I would also say is that if you maintain a more civil libertarian approach to the First Amendment, to religious free exercise, etc., you're going to be increasingly distant from the contemporary Republican Party. If you retain, say, a Reagan conservative view, sort of the power of our alliances and the importance of NATO and resisting Russian aggression, you're going to be more distant from the Republican Party. And both sides then look at each other and say, "What happened to you?"
Yeah. This is one quick follow-up, and it's almost an impossible question. And so if you must pass, then pass. But I think that there's so much kind of cognitive dissonance. There's so much confusion with people just trying to make sense of what the heck is really going on. If you had to give like a 2 to 3 sentence, what is all of this that we find ourselves in the midst of boiled down to in 2 to 3 minutes? In 2 to 3 sentences.
Two to three sentences for what is going on in the universe.
Yeah, in the American political scene.
Well, I think you had groups of people who were doing the same thing, but now it's revealed were coming from completely different motivations. And as one commentator put it, that we realized that the things that we thought were central and the things we thought were peripheral actually were reversed in some of those alliances. And I know a lot of the things that I would have argued, well, that's a caricature. So, for instance, I would spend a lot of my time saying, those of you who say that churches who want to have more traditional gender roles are misogynistic, that's just a complete caricature. It's not the case. Now I look and say, oh, there's a significant portion of people who actually were motivated by very hostile misogyny toward women. We've seen that in sexual abuse crisis and in other places. So I think there's been kind of an apocalypse and unveiling of that in many ways. And I think you also have with the breakdown of the institutions. So you can see this in the Republican Party. You can see it in a lot of the Christian denominations. The breakdown of the institutions has led to a kind of mob rule that's been fueled by social media. And so there's this illusion that, for instance, someone asked me the other day about Donald Trump reaching out to evangelical leaders. And I say he doesn't have to, because the myth is that you reach the evangelical leaders and the evangelical leaders reach their constituencies. That is how it used to work. Donald Trump can go right around the leaders and mobilize his base, and the evangelical leaders are afraid of the followers, so they will adjust accordingly. Yeah. That's happened in almost every institution.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I just want to point this out, not get commentary yet. If you want to come back to it later, that'd be great. But you use the language of apocalyptic unveiling there, and typically in biblical literature, apocalyptic is the unveiling of forces out there. But you're kind of pointing to apocalyptic unveiling of the church itself, which is maybe an interesting twist.
Well, I think it's both. I think there's an unveiling of all kinds of factors that are affecting the church and other institutions that we never realized were there. And I think some of that has to do with especially in my more conservative evangelical world, there was this sense that the outside world is affected with this faulty worldview, and they're the ones who are accommodating to the culture. Now I think what we've seen is that we were accommodating to a culture even more than the people we were arguing against, because when the Apostle Paul says in the Bible, "Be not conformed to the world," you can just as easily accommodate to a subculture as you can to a larger culture, and that's what happened in evangelicalism.
Now, Russell got more than 2 or 3 sentences.
I'm sorry.
But if
I'm grateful. That gave me time. It gave me some time to think about this. So I'm going to go with, if I'm going to go with 2 or 3 sentences, I'm going to go back to the Yeats poem, Second Coming. Mm-hmm. The center does not hold. The best, what is the worst are full of passionate intensity, and the best lack all conviction. This is what is happening all over the place. And this goes to the institutional point that Russell was talking about. In many cases, because the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity, who wins these internal conflicts? The worst, those who are full of passionate intensity. And what we're beginning to see is really a part of a movement is motivated by true hatred. I mean, I'm talking when it comes to things like the misogyny that Russell was talking about. We have seen in my former denomination, the PCA, there are a remnant of Kenists and outright sort of white nationalists that are along the fringes. We've seen that some in the Southern Baptist Convention. We have seen that there is an element that is motivated by what you would call sort of true hatred and bigotry. But there's a larger element that's really motivated by fear.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is because that larger element is motivated by fear, they have this overwhelming fear of the left. they're incredibly vulnerable to the voices, the most strident voices. And they're also incredibly reluctant to do anything about those strident voices because they don't want to weaken the coalition. They don't want to weaken themselves in the face of a hostile world. And so there's the circle the wagons mentality. And they're not, there's this concept you've heard sometimes online, no enemies to the right, that it's fatally weakening us. It's weakening us if we do anything about some of these really vengeful and malicious forces. And so that's how you get into a place where in many ways, almost the worst elements become the dominant voice. And the larger group of people who in many ways don't like that. They don't like the rhetoric. They don't like the ideas, but they have a greater concern for the left. And so they will not do one thing to sort of eliminate that, to ameliorate the harm or to prevent the harm caused by those voices. And it acts like a one-way ratchet. It's just towards extremism and towards extremism.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is I think it's a fear not only of the left, but it is a fear of the far right as well.
For sure.
And specifically the fear is of being called the left.
Yes.
And so the message is you're not really one of us if you are critiquing something that we're doing. And so there's this psychological sense of, okay, well, let's give people what they want a little bit, and then they'll settle down and get on board, and we can go back to doing what we were called to do.
Right.
And that just isn't happening.
Yep. So, what you guys are pointing to there is a fundamental question about whether or not we have sufficient character formation to be able to have conviction, right, and to act out of conviction,
right,
and to call things that formerly we would have called fundamentally unjust or fundamentally unfair or fundamentally social exercises of hatred, what they are, right? So what hope do you have of, in the kind of consumerist world that we're in, of there being sufficient forces, possibilities for the kind of character formation that we need today?
I mean, there is, let me preface this by contrasting my Twitter feed and my inbox. Okay. So the Twitter feed, Twitter and social media world it's full of the people who are sort of who are the most committed, most activist subset of Americans. And they are highly aggressive. They are highly polarized. They are immovable and often quite malicious. And so you could go on to, Twitter and look at the responses to Russell, look at the responses to me, and think that, and it would be, if that's your snapshot, you would think that the church is full of militantly, potentially even flirting with violence, militant Christians who are essentially wanting to launch sort of a new crusade to transform America from the ground up as a Christian nation, often tinged with white nationalism. And you would think that, wow, this is a dominant strand of Christianity. Then you look at the inbox, people who are not wanting to weigh into that cesspool, more normal, average, everyday people who are absolutely in despair. They don't know what to do. They don't know how things got out of control. They're asking the very questions that you're asking. But the reason why it's in the inbox and not on Twitter is they don't want to be swarmed. They don't want to be attacked. Even raising questions can create an atmosphere of bullying and intimidation. And so the reality is there's so many people who are deeply discontent with the present state of affairs, but they have been bullied. They have been intimidated. We know about this because we know of this whole concept of the exhausted majority, and they're just shrinking back. But what gives me hope is they might be exhausted, but they're still a majority. There's still a majority. That means there's an enormous amount of latent cultural and political power that can do something about this. But we have to move it from passive to active.
Yeah, and if you think of what Walker Percy said, the most dangerous thing is the despair that doesn't know it's despair. I think there have been a lot of people who, through this time of great grief in American life, have thought, well, let's just press through this and then we'll get back to the way things used to be. I think we're at a point now where people realize we're not going back to the way things used to be. Something new is happening. And as Jesus said, blessed are those who hunger and thirst. There has to be a longing for something different. And I see that all over the place. There are a lot of people who are saying we can't yet define exactly what the next thing is that God is about to do, but something is happening and we want it. And I see that as a good sign.
So recently, both of you guys, along with Curtis Chang, is that correct pronunciation?
Yes, Curtis Chang, yes.
So recently, both of you two, along with Curtis Chang, have developed the After Party. So for those who are unaware, what's the After Party about, and what are you trying to do with that?
It's a curriculum for Christian political engagement, but it's different from, I think, any other curriculum that I've seen. I'm no stranger to these kinds of curricula. I mean, I grew up in the 80s in the era of worldview training, where you would go somewhere for some time and you'd learn how to be a good Christian anti-communist, for example. And all of the training, all of these curricula that I have seen, I'm not saying all of them, but all that I have seen, and certainly the ones that gained a lot of currency, were all issue-oriented. So this is what Christians should believe about abortion. This is what Christians should believe about religious liberty, about economics, about foreign policy, about. And so what it did, though, is it created a mindset and a view amongst many Christians that politics is about outcomes. That's what politics is about, period. And what we have done with the After Party is reset the frame, because if you look at Scripture has a lot more to say about how we're to interact with our neighbor, how we're to interact with the world, than it has to say about any specific policy outcome. And in fact, for even being defined in front of the world, what is the fruit of the Spirit? It isn't complementarianism, conservatism, and republicanism. That's not the fruit of the Spirit. It's kindness, peace, patience, gentleness, self-control, and all of these other virtues. And so what we're trying to say is, wait, let's pause for a minute. We have over-instructed on issues, and we have under-instructed on character and on love. And so what we're doing is it's refocusing. And I think we're refocusing according to the biblical priority, which places that premium on loving your neighbor, on how we treat our neighbor, how we interact in the public square.
And we already have models for that in terms of the way that, for instance, we've talked about work. Over the past several years, there's been quite an emphasis on vocation and how to see your Christianity showing up in your work. Those things aren't teaching you how to do electrical work. They're teaching you how to be an electrician who's a follower of Christ, who has integrity, who is able to see your work as not cordoned off, but actually part of your calling. Those things, that's a little bit of what we're doing here. And the other thing is to say, I think there are a lot of people who wrongly assume when they look at the crisis in the churches that the problem is with the pastors. So the pastors are coming in and they're not teaching or preaching adequately. They have this sense that if the pastor just comes in and lays out the marching orders, then the congregation is shaped by that in 1 hour a week and changed. And that's not how change actually happens. Instead, you have to have groups within churches that are starting to say, wait, this isn't the way we want to be. This isn't the way we want to go. We want something different, and we want to explore together how to get there.
Yeah.
And so that's what this does, which is to say, let's reset our priorities. What's the ultimate goal? That's why it's the After Party. David and I originally had the title "The Post-Partisan Church Project," and David's wife Nancy, who is a much better writer than any of us, said, "No, how about the After Party?"
Yes.
And that focuses not only on kind of a time after this toxic partisanship, but also the ultimate after party, the wedding supper of the Lamb. We've got a kingdom of God view. That's what's ultimate. And so if we put that first, then that helps us to carry out all of those subordinate callings better.
Yeah. You, I've gone through the whole curriculum, and I think it's very helpful. And surprisingly, I would imagine to a lot of folks, in addition to what you just said, is you focus a lot on hope and humility and the way those two practices kind of correlate or not to a certain kind of vision. And one of the things I like about the way I do that is you're pretty confessional yourselves about, okay, this is kind of where I fall on that hope humility quadrant. And at my best, I look like this. At my worst, I look like this. And
Right.
I think that kind of willingness to invite people to first ask about ourselves rather than first asking about the other is itself a really helpful, instructive, exemplary approach.
Well, yeah, you know, one of the things we did not want to do is present ourselves as some sort of like platonic form of cultural engagement. Like that's not.
No.
I have made mistakes. And it's interesting. We've all made mistakes. All of us behind the curriculum, we've all made mistakes, and they were different based on sort of our disposition and our personality. I'm a former litigator. I have always been pretty combative. Now, I've always tried to advance my ideas in a way that's civil and respects the, humanity and dignity of my political and legal opponents. But that's been my temptation, is to be the more combative person. And sometimes it doesn't go well. Sometimes that's not the right approach. And so, one of the things that we talk about and really center this analysis around is Micah 6:8, because it's such a beautiful, short articulation of our obligations as believers. What does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? It is to act justly. It is to love kindness, and it is to walk humbly with the Lord your God. And in our current political environment, we have a giant amount of people going for justice with their fists raised, right? And very little kindness and almost no humility. And each one of those obligations exists side by side. They're not optional. Mm-hmm. And so you cannot forsake kindness and humility for the sake of justice. You cannot forsake justice for the sake of kindness and humility. You have to harmonize these values. And right now, we are heavily weighted towards the issue advocacy, justice issues, and often believing that kindness and humility are a fool's game, a sucker's game. What? You're going to get beat. You're going to lose if you exhibit these kinds of values. And we're trying to confront that mindset, that the biblical model, which includes that kindness and that humility, is not something to be discarded when you think you might lose an election.
Yeah. I assume, just for sake of clarification, when you say we have a lot of fists raised on behalf of justice and not a lot of humility and kindness, is that an apt description for you of what's happening on both the right and the left?
At the far edges, there's this theory called horseshoe theory, that as people get more extreme, they become more alike, not necessarily in their underlying political views. So you could have a far right person who's very pro-life and a far left person who's very pro-choice, but in the means of their engagement, they become very much alike. They become very punitive. They become very pugilistic. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing this as sort of a dominant way in which the activist class is interacting with Americans. And now whenever you say right and left, everyone immediately jumps to, moral equivalency. No. Mm-hmm. I'm not doing moral equivalency. I am saying that there are similar phenomena on both sides of the aisle that have greater or lesser degrees of danger, sort of depending on who's the prime mover or the prime actor. So while I oppose many things that say are happening on college campuses, I might think an encampment at Harvard is less of a danger in the moment to American democracy than, say, the front runner for the presidency of the United States and Donald Trump. And so, but that does not mean that some of this conduct that you see on the far left is in any way excusable or good or okay or helpful to us. Yeah. And so this is, so we're identifying a phenomenon we see in individuals on both sides of the aisle, no question.
And you can see quite a difference in terms of maturity and wisdom with people on the left between those who will say, look at what's happened on the right. This is what it always was. Anytime anybody's a conservative, this is who they really are. And so we have to just totally win and dominate them. As opposed to someone who says, this is a real problem. We actually do need a healthy two-party system in this country. We actually do need conservatives and progressives and moderates in this country. And this could happen to us. And what would we do? if we're in that situation. Those are two very different responses to the crisis.
Yeah. I loved the story in the after party about Nancy befriending a critic of yours.
Yeah.
Did you tell that story?
That's a tremendous story. So, Nancy, we've been walking through this challenge together, and we've responded in some interesting and different ways. And one of the things that Nancy did some time ago was after she had written in the Washington Post about being a victim of sex abuse as a 12-year-old at the hands of a Sunday school teacher, a vacation Bible school teacher. And what was really discouraging to her was how many people in the church were angry at her for talking about that story. And she began to look for friends where she could find them. If somebody was kind to her online, she would respond to them. And one of the people who was kind to her and she responded to, when she kind of dug into this person's social media past and history, found out that this person hated me. I mean, hated me with capital H, hated me. And mainly because I'm a longtime pro-life advocate and lawyer, and she was pro-choice, and very militantly so. But Nancy also saw, as she saw this just vitriol pouring out on me, that during the pandemic, the height of the early lockdowns and shutdowns, that this person named Kathy was having trouble getting food. And so Nancy reached out to her and said, "How can I help?" And when in this discussion found out that Kathy was disabled and shut in and unable to leave and shop, and all the groceries stores were swamped with they couldn't deliver to her. And so Nancy activated a group of people, including some dear friends of ours, to help get Kathy food. And during that process, which was ultimately wildly successful, Kathy got overwhelmed with food. They formed a friendship, a very genuine friendship. Now, it doesn't mean that Kathy is pro-life now. It doesn't mean that Nancy is pro-choice now, but they formed a very genuine and deep friendship. And guess what? So did Kathy and I. And culminating in this just wonderful moment when Nancy was telling a story at the Lincoln Center in New York for a storytelling group called The Moth. Yeah. And she invited Kathy to come to the Lincoln Center to hear her. And I escorted Kathy arm in arm to her seat. And it was just a beautiful example, I think, of how when you put into practice the principles of the after party, where you love your neighbor, even if you disagree with your neighbor, you love your neighbor, you can achieve an enormous amount of healing and reconciliation and create genuine friendships.
Yeah, it is a beautiful picture of possibilities that,
yes.
I hope that we can lean into. So this is in some ways, I hope not too narrowly technical or theological question, but let me ask this question. It seems like in the after party, you are presuming what I would call the sociological importance of the church, that in some ways trumps or prioritizes is to be prioritized over U.S. political categories. Is that fair assessment for kind of what you might be doing there?
Well, I mean, ultimately, as Christians, yes, we believe the priority of the church in terms of the fact the church is the body of Christ, united to Christ. The church is permanent in the way that no political system or political body ever is. And so it's seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Doesn't mean the other things aren't important. But yes, we do believe that the church is important in shaping and forming who we are to be as followers of Christ.
Yeah. Any commentary on that?
I agree completely.
Okay. So then with the after party, you're focusing upon these are ways we want to engage with one another politically, while continuing to insist this doesn't mean that these various issues of justice are unimportant. We still must engage these. While the bulk of your work, at least public-facing work, has been focusing upon contemporary American issues of society and politics, how do you envision moving from one to the other? That is, do you see this as having to do some sort of work of translation from one to the other, or do you feel like there's a sort of direct from here to there?
Help me a bit more with the question. So are you talking about what's the transition between the sort of peacemaking element of the after party, where you're focusing on the kindness and the humility, transition to how do you also perform the justice element of it? Is that sort of...
That would be, yeah, maybe that would be part A. So let's work with that. And then I've got a part B that I'll come to in a minute.
Right. Now, it's really interesting. The dynamic that I have seen is you will often see people who are issue people, and then you'll have people who are like pluralism people or democracy people or peacemaking people. And so essentially what they say, that if once you get into one category, like I'm the person who's trying to host the difficult conversations, I'm the person who's trying to bring people together, it becomes very difficult to also be an issue person, because as soon as you raise an issue,
right,
then you're being divisive.
Right.
Right. So what we're trying to do is say, no, we have to do all of it. And we have to be able to be an issue person. That's the justice element, while maintaining these other commitments. And so part of it is, while the after party is not an issue curriculum, it is not. Russell and I, we are often issue people. We will be talking about specific issues. I talk a ton about foreign policy, about constitutional law, about the 2024 presidential election. So the way I think to deal with that is we try to model the values that we seek to advance. And that gets into things like trying to meet people where they are in reaching out to individuals with whom you disagree, acknowledging the validity of their points, reading sort of the best expression of the other side's point of view so that you don't form caricatures, treating people with dignity and respect even when you disagree with them. And so the after-party curriculum itself is not your issue suite. But what we're saying is you have your issues. And the after party should be very influential in how you then walk out into the public square and address those issues that are so close to your heart.
Yeah.
I often give the example of a conversation I saw happen one time in a church with two city council members in that community. One of whom came up and said, I'm really concerned about what the Bible teaches about widows and orphans. We have a lot of single women in our community who can't support their children, and I'm really working to raise the minimum wage here in order to address that. Another city council member said, I'm really concerned about the single mothers in our community and their children. I'm afraid if we move the minimum wage up, that the businesses are going to cut hours, and that's going to sacrifice their health insurance. Okay, those two people are both coming at this with a character that's formed in the right direction. The motivations are, now they can get together and argue out the prudential differences. That's very different from the hypothetical third person who might come in and say, these single women, they should be married, they're losers and takers, we shouldn't be concerned about it. That would be something that ought to be corrected immediately and at the character level, not just the issue level.
I mean, that does seem to me to be something that's so often overlooked, is that you can have people who have fundamentally different policy preferences, but really do want the same thing.
They want the same thing.
Yeah.
And if they actually, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, if they actually start wrestling through the issue together, rather than simply looking back to say, well, what is my tribe thinking about the fact that I'm talking to this person, they realize, oh, we actually do care about the same thing, and there might be a third way to get there.
Yeah, yeah. So part B maybe on my question is, I noticed that in the after party, you typically, when the word politics or political is employed, it always refers to U.S. governmental policy, social issues that get determined by local, state, or federal governing bodies. And I think that I wish you wouldn't do that. And so here's why I suggest that. In my mind, Christianity is political through and through. So when one speaks, say, of forgiveness, practice of forgiveness, or practice of reconciliation, or the honoring of marriage, or love of enemies. Those are all perennial political questions, right? And moreover, loads of New Testament scholarship in the last couple of decades has said you can't read the New Testament aright if you don't see the immediate political message this gospel is vis-a-vis the Roman Empire and Roman imperialism. And so I wonder sometimes if some of the messes that we've gotten ourselves into is because we will say things like Christianity is not political. And I wonder if we would actually come out and say, no, Christianity is political because all of this stuff, and these are explicitly political practices to which we are called. And then it calls us perhaps to a different kind of translation process to the governmental politics.
Yeah, so I would say we have to be careful about the word political versus the word partisan.
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things with the after party is you're seeing that we are talking and implicit within much of the content is this idea that Christianity isn't partisan, okay? Now, as far as the political aspect, the real issue that we're addressing is we have seen countless instances where you take a person who, in so many areas of their life, has a holistic approach, brings the gospel holistically into their life. So to go back to Russell's business example, they would not say that being a Christian businessman means deploying the Bible to achieve profit maximization. Right. They would say it means, I want to do well in my business, but how do I treat my customers? How do I treat my employees? What kind of integrity do I show when their financial headwinds are strong? And all of that there's a holistic approach. And so what we have seen is in politics, all of a sudden, it's almost like it's carved out of that otherwise holistic approach. And so what we're trying to do is actually take the holistic gospel-oriented approach that we take to everything else and say, it includes this too. And so I feel as if it's actually trying to pull the politics into the unified whole, as opposed to looking at it sort of as its own thing that has its own rules and has its own terms and means of engagement. And this has been actually the number one pushback that we've gotten, which has been, but if we do what you say, then what we might lose, and the outcome of politics is the paramount objective. That's paramount. That's everything. Again, note how that's a carve out from the holistic way that we view all of the other areas of our lives. So I feel as if what we're doing is we're trying to say of this one area, that's the reason we use that term political a lot, because it has been pulled away by people in their ethos and in their worldview. And we're saying, pull it back in, that this is part of the integrated whole. Yeah. It's not its own
Pull
thing.
it back in a nonpartisan
right.
In a nonpartisan way.
Right.
Yeah.
And even when it is shorthand, it's a shorthand for what most people in congregations are thinking of right now when they think of the word politics, right. Which is not only not what you and I would mean by the political internal life of the church as part of the kingdom of God. It's also not even what we would think of historically as politics. It's not about getting a series of things done. It's about tribal identification. So even that has shifted. So it reminds me of, I had a sermon series one time on a Christian view of sex. Had an older man in the congregation very upset about that because he said the sexual intercourse is not sex. Sex is man and woman. I'm like, okay, but for most of the people that we're talking to, this is the way they're thinking. You're actually right in the broader picture of things, but we're going to speak to what they're actually thinking they're talking about here.
Yeah. Over the last decade, with all the change and things that we've already kind of nodded to, a question about just you personally. When you think about prudence or wisdom for navigating the challenges, the pressures that you have dealt with, what are some things that you've learned just how to be a human being who stays in pursuit of your sense of vocation, in pursuit of what you understand to be a good life, in a way that sticks with it, in a way that seems... As a listener of No Small Endeavor, you might be concerned about the intangible things that help us live a good life. We explore this on our show, but we haven't yet explored how our niche interests can help us accomplish this. Like, for example, my decade-long niche interest in flying sailplanes, gliders. Good thing there's an entire podcast devoted to this effort to glean meaning from little-known niche interests and help us understand why they matter, all while being sincerely curious and hopeful. It's called Niche to Meet You, and it was recently picked by Apple Podcast for their new and noteworthy editorial list. The show reminds me of my recent conversation with David Brooks, in which he says, the way you pay attention to people becomes the way you live in the world. We welcome you to listen to the Niche to Meet You podcast, and when you leave a review, tell them No Small Endeavor sent you. Enjoy. To lend itself toward flourishing of some sort.
I remember I had a friend years ago who was talking about his dad, who was a doctor. And he said, my dad was a very good man, but he never understood that he was not his gift. And so the minute that he stopped being a doctor, he said he died almost immediately because he couldn't think of himself outside of that category. Part of it is the constant reminder, not only I am not my gift set, but also I am not an extension of whatever tribe I believed myself to be part of, and that some of this homelessness that's really disorienting for a lot of people actually is the Hebrews 11 pattern that all of us will face one at one point or the other. And so to embrace that, and then to say, I mean, there's a way I think we can all count the loss of the things that have gone away, the friendships, the relationships, those things, without having a sense of gratitude for all the relationships and the friendships that have been brought together, of a kind of a band of brothers and sisters who understand each other better than they ever would have before. And also to what I've noticed in some of the tumult of the past several years is how I need people in unique ways. So there's one friend of mine for whom what I need from him is gallows humor. And so he's the one who, when I went to his house in one of the darkest days of the Southern Baptist situation, he met me at the door and said, well, good news is you can have bourbon now. And we just stopped and laughed, and I realized I haven't laughed in a long time. Yeah. And then there are other people you need other things from. So I think there's I have another friend who, what I needed from her was to call and say, I want to remind you who you are to Jesus. You need those things. And so I think a sense of gratitude of, okay, this really is reminding me what it is to be part of the larger body of Christ in unique ways. I think we should be grateful for that.
I want to echo that gratitude point. Nancy, my wife and I made sort of a pact with each other when all of this journey, when we began to see what was coming, when we could see, because it was, I'll be honest, initially a big shock to us to have so many members of our own church body actually very angry at us for not supporting Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. Now, in hindsight, in 2024, I say those words and someone would say, how naive, how naive. But in 2015, 2016, I had believed all of these words that had been spoken for so long about character and integrity and how bad adultery was and all of this and sexual assault and sexual abuse were disqualifiers for high office. And I believed all those words. And so when you go and say, hey, look, this guy too, and all of a sudden, not only are people disagreeing with you, which, okay, disagreement is just part of life, but they're turning on you as if you're Benedict Arnold, as if you're not just wrong, you're a traitor.
And an apostate,
a heretic. Just Google heretic and Russell Moore or heretic and David French. And so it was a shock to the system. It really was a shock. And so at that point in time, Nancy and I said, we're not going to end any relationships over politics, but if people end them with us, we can't help that. Mm-hmm. And Nancy had a great way of saying it. He said, at the end of this, we're going to still have friends. They might be different friends in some ways. Mm-hmm. And that has been true. I have had a core group of friends that have stuck with us through thick and thin, that have been our friends for decades and will be our friends for a lifetime. We've had some surprising people just absolutely reject us. And then I've been blessed to meet some new friends who are some of the greatest people I've ever known. And I'm grateful to go back to Russell, because but for this political division, but for this moment, I would have never known, not only not have had the benefit of the friendship, but I would have not had the benefit of having my eyes opened to some of the just truly wonderful people who just a few short years ago, I would have said, oh, those are my political opponents. Those are over there, and I'm over here. But it's been a gift. It has been a blessing to get to know some of these wonderful folks.
What theological and or political convictions, or maybe better, what political and or theological questions, open questions, persist with you that might surprise folks?
It might surprise folks.
Yeah.
So that's a really good question. I gave a talk yesterday in Houston at a Lipscomb event, and one of the things that I said is, as every month goes by, I'm holding theology more lightly and love more tightly. And by that, what I mean is I have become extremely and excruciatingly aware that an enormous amount of what is happening in Christian circles is an immense amount of cruelty in the name of truth and theology. Okay, so my belief system is so obviously correct that if you don't agree with me, there is a character deficiency with you, that you must be defeated, destroyed, sidelined, etc. And what's really come home to me is this reality that when Paul, in Galatians is saying, okay, how do we tell, like, what's the fruit? What's the markers? And I said this already, but the fruit is not a set of theological propositions. The fruit of the Spirit is a set of virtues, and specifically virtues that demonstrate real love and affection for other human beings: kindness, peace, patience, gentleness, self-control, etc. And so for me, I have become much more disengaged from the back and forth of the battles over what's the best theology / ideology. And I'm much more interested in who is demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit, who is showing these virtues, who is exhibiting these virtues, and gravitating in that direction, gravitating towards the fruit and away from this constant civil conflict surrounding surrounding all of the various theological issues that are dividing the church.
I would agree with that. I would say that when I started out in ministry, one of the things that disturbed me was a kind of nominal cultural Christianity in the Bible Belt that I suspected as a teenager, maybe this really is just about politics or about Southern culture. I think I was right in that diagnosis, but I was wrong in what I thought would correct it, because I thought what would correct it is a more robust theology, meaning knowledge of theological concepts and propositions. And one of the things that I have seen over the past 30 years is that many of the people and the movements that I thought would get us out of that actually turned out to be more of a problem than even the nominal cultural Christianity to which they were responding, in terms of cruelty, in terms of misogyny, in terms of instrumentalization, that turning Christianity into a means to an end, and even turning these theological concepts into a means to an end. And so I think I've had a similar sense of actually, and the other part of it is I noticed as a seminary professor that I would have very theologically oriented students who knew all the theological controversies and knew how to answer women in ministry or predestination or those things with Bible verses, but they didn't know the difference between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And that seemed to be just an incidental matter. So you had people who actually didn't didn't find themselves in the flow of the biblical text, but rather saw the text as a way to mine out arguments for these propositions. I now see that to be a really dangerous place, and a place where I previously was.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, this point about, I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with Tim Keller years and years and years ago. So this is maybe 06, 07. And he said something really interesting that has stuck with me ever since. And he said, I've noticed a change. The younger folks in our church, if their friendships cannot survive a disagreement any longer. It used to be that the younger folks in our church could disagree, and sometimes the disagreement was a feature in the friendship. It was part of the joy of the friendship. And he said, what I'm seeing now is that that's going away, that the friendships cannot survive disagreement. And one of the reasons is the disagreement was seen as evidence of a defect. And that goes to this humility point that we were talking about earlier. If you think that through, if I'm a kind of person who can't be your friend, Lee, if we disagree over some of these really consequential and very complicated things, war and peace, for example, how arrogant am I to assume that your disagreement is proof or evidence of a character defect, that your disagreement with me, like, what do I have to think of myself? And so I feel like that has been, for me, a very humbling and very important revelation, that I too am tempted with this sense that I'm so right, and that if you disagree with me, there's something wrong with you, as opposed to, hey, what's unconditional is that we have love and respect for each other.
Yeah.
And then let's dive into whatever we disagree about.
Well, and if you look at what's happened in, say, states that have gone completely red or completely blue, they have super majorities of each. You typically have a lot of craziness that is happening there. And why? Because you don't have to make the case to somebody else as to why we should do that. And I've seen that reflected back in churches as well. I mean, often when you have churches that have some differences, not on key core issues like the resurrection of Christ, but they have some differences in the congregation, they're having to explain to one another, look, when I'm emphasizing the sovereignty of God, I'm not talking about a lack of responsibility in human beings. Or when we're emphasizing the free will of people, we're not saying that God is not God. You have to make those arguments. And when you don't have to make them, you soon forget them.
Yeah.
And you actually turn into the caricature that someone warned you about.
Yeah, that in that way, diversity itself becomes a necessary gift to a community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's this whole concept of the law of group polarization that we talk about in the curriculum, which is when like-minded people gather, they tend to become more extreme. And sometimes the extremism becomes so great that if you give like-minded people enough time together in one room, the whole group can become more extreme than the most extreme person was at the start of the deliberation. And so this is one of the problems that we have seen in a lot of American institutions, is this groupthink. And then the worse it gets, the harder it is to break, because you become so convinced of the totality of the truth on your side. And this is where you'll get into situations where people use terms like democrat to describe their political opponents, because they're so totally convinced of the rightness of their side that opposition goes from being wrong, it goes from, to being actually evil to being actually demonic in character. And then once you're at that point, it's so hard to have a conversation.
Yeah.
And what is impossible sometimes for us to see is that actually is secularization. The very thing that some people are driven to extremism because they're afraid of secularization often are not aware of how they have secularized. So, for instance, if you're using spiritual warfare categories from the New Testament that explicitly apply to principalities and powers, not to human beings of flesh and blood, well, you're doing what we used to call Protestant liberalism. You're taking concepts from the Bible that are supernatural and simply emptying them of that supernatural content. and turning them into something else. And so you have all the fervor that's meant to be directed toward spiritual warfare that comes in a very different way through the cross, through the way of the Spirit, and you simply turn it into a metaphor for I'm really, really mad at these evil people.
Yeah, yeah.
Here's a good shorthand, I think, to where if you're losing your moorings, here's a good shorthand. If you hear that somebody shares your faith, so they're a Christian or evangelical, maybe even in your denomination, so they don't just share your faith, but they're also part of your sub-tribe within larger Christianity, and then you hear they're of the opposite political party, is your gut reaction one that says they're a brother or sister, or is your gut reaction that you're immediately suspicious of them? Then you might be putting politics over faith as at your bottom line test for who you respect, who you have regard for.
Yeah. So where we find ourselves right now in the midst of social, political context, what most immediately has your attention as far as particular happenings that are causing you concern?
Well, I think there are a lot of people who assume that 2024 is a repeat of 2020 because it's the same players, or a repeat of 2016. You'll often hear people, especially in churches, who will say, I can't believe we're going through this again. I do not think that that is the case at all, for a number of reasons. I mean, one of them being part of what was so traumatic about 2016 is what we talked about earlier, this sense of disorientation and betrayal. I can't believe that you would support him, or I can't believe you wouldn't support him. That kind of dynamic, which is no longer there. We're kind of numb to all of that in many cases. But the problem is, in fact, the numbness. There are things that are on the table right now that if either David or I or you had said in 2016, look, I'm concerned about the fact that you will one day wave away sexual assault or paying off porn stars in order to influence elections, or inciting mobs on the United States Capitol in order to stop the certification of an election, we would have been seen as deranged.
Yeah,
and
alarmist.
We would have seen ourselves as deranged. We would have said, we're not saying that. We're saying this. Well, now we're at a point where all of that has become so normalized that it's not even when a jury finds the now Republican nominee guilty of sexual assault that the judge calls rape, it's not even on the front page of the newspapers, because this sort of thing has just become so common to us. And I'm afraid that political violence has also become common to us. There's not a sense of shock about that anymore. And so I'm very, very worried about what could happen in a number of different scenarios.
You know, one of the things that I don't think enough people are aware of is the extent to which a culture of intimidation, bullying, harassment, and outright threat has become endemic.
Yeah.
Just endemic on the right, to such an extent that you can almost guarantee that if you've talked to a public figure, of even people with relatively small public platforms, you can almost guarantee if you talk to a public figure who has opposed Donald Trump, that they will tell you stories of harassment, intimidation, attempts to destroy their career, threats against their lives, potentially threats against their family. This is not unusual at all. And what is so distressing to me is that this has become that when people hear about this on the right, many of them, their initial reaction is not anger that this is occurring. It's anger that you're talking about it. Mm-hmm. And why is there anger that you're talking about it? Well, because it might cause people not to support Donald Trump. And they have to support Donald Trump because America may fall, America might die. And it's a shame that there's all these threats and everything out there, but the stakes are that high. And I would say the thing that has been most discouraging to me in the church's reaction to the moment has not been about the group of people who are the the threateners and the intimidators and the harassers and all of that. It has not been that they exist. You know that those people exist in this world. A nation of 300 million people, you're going to have a lot of bad apples in that mix. The thing that has gotten me is that the incredible indifference to the point of enablement that you have seen from the institutional church, including the unbelievable apathy of people in the pews to what is being done in their name. And it's not just apathy, it's a sense of victimhood. You know, one of the things that people say, you know, folks in the pews have long said is, why doesn't the media like us? You know, why doesn't the media like us? Well, I'm, you know, in the media, and I can start to see some insights about that. So, for example, if almost all of your communications with rank and file Christians consists of name-calling, insults, malice, sometimes threats, are you going to develop a great, and then there's no pushback on that? No one's saying stop? No one's standing up to it? And if that's your experience, what are you going to think of that group of people? What are you? And it's going to be fair, by the way. It's going to be fair to think that a group of people that stands by while an angry and potentially violent fringe harasses, bullies, and tries character assassination. Why? Why? Because they think that I'm so dangerous, I'm going to destroy America. It is so incredibly dispiriting. It is so dispiriting. And it has really changed my view on this sort of idea that you say, well, there's just only a few people who are really bad. Everyone else is just great. Everyone. No, there's a lot of apathy. There's a lot of enabling that's going on here. And at the heart of it is a lot of fear and anger. And that's what's deeply discouraging.
And a lot of the threats, intimidation, and I mean serious threats and intimidation, doesn't just come to people like David and me who have been opposed to this political movement from the very beginning. It's with people who are in that movement, but who deviate on any one part of it. They are then receiving that, sometimes with even more force, because they're traitors. That's not an American way of civic life, and it's certainly not a moral way of civic life.
For those looking forward to a repeat of 2016, who stands out to you the most as the people that you're paying attention to as to what they're saying or projecting? So, for example, is somebody like Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation, or others, who would you point to as saying, we need to know what those folks are saying?
That's a great question, because the answer is much more difficult than you might think. Because the bottom line is that Trumpism is not really, aside from his consistent sort of anti-immigrant perspective, Trumpism is not really an ideological movement in the sense of it has a specific set of policy ideas. There are people within the Trump movement who are trying to fill the empty suit. So Trumpism at its core is the ambition of one man, Donald Trump. And a lot of people have hitched onto it like remoras on a shark, right? And so they're riding this Trump wave, and they're trying to give it meaning and purpose beyond what Donald Trump even thinks about it. So when you think about Heritage Foundation or Project 2025 and some of these more sort of Christian nationalist initiatives attached to Donald Trump, the idea that Trump is going to be your grand crusader against porn is hilarious. But the thinking is more, we're loyal to him to the end of our days. And so therefore we are pushing on an open door when it comes to access to power and influence. And so the North Star is Trump, okay? So who do you look at? You look at Trump, and everyone will react to him to maintain that access. And so he will set the tone, and then everything else is subordinate to the tone he sets. But then other people will try to the extent that Project 2025 or civil service reform or some of these other ideas that are floating out there are implemented, they are only possible to the extent that the people advancing them are wrapping both their arms around Trump.
And also, I think there is a way that people have consistently not taken Trump himself seriously when he says, this is what I want to do. And so at every point, I mean, you think of before the 2020 election and then immediately after, so many people are saying, well, let's just kind of humor him in the fact that he's grieving the fact that he lost the election, and he'll get there in a few weeks. And then, of course, we saw what happened. We're seeing the same thing right now when he is saying explicitly in interview after interview after interview, I want to use the levers of the federal government to enact revenge and retribution against those who do not support me. Sean Hannity has tried to walk him back from that. Dr. Phil, of all people, has tried to walk him back from that. And in both of those cases, he said, no, that's exactly what I mean. And then you look at also the fact that many of the people who are part of this movement don't just want to win the levers of federal power. They also want to win church denominational power and are working toward that end. That's a very frightening reality, and most people are just completely asleep to it.
Well, and there's no lines here in their support for Trump. I mean, because look, what I was told and what I have been browbeaten with from 2015 on is, well, I don't like Trump either, but he's pro-life. And that is the issue. That is the most important issue. Every other issue falls. And then he comes out and he's not just pro-states choosing, okay, which is, there is a pro-life position that is, look, I'm against Roe. This is a matter for the states. But the pro-life position is then to say, here's what states should do. States should pass the most, pro-life bill that they can reasonably get through a legislature, so long as it's intelligently and compassionately drafted. No, he's not that. He's like, whatever they want. And then when you press him on it, he doesn't like Florida's heartbeat bill. So I think he's the most pro-choice Republican presidential candidate of my adult lifetime, and it's not close anymore. And there is no hint that there's the slightest crack in the evangelical support for Donald Trump. And so the lines just don't seem to exist at all anymore. And part of the reason is there's one area where someone wrote to me before 2016, and they were exactly right. He said, here's what you need to know, David, is that if Trump wins, all the evangelicals that backed him will have total access to him. And that was true. Mm-hmm. That was true. Trump is kind of a diabolical political genius in that way. He doesn't care if somebody's super controversial in the world. He doesn't care if somebody has a record of religious extremism that would be embarrassing if people knew it in public. He'll bring them right into the Oval Office so long as they hug him tightly enough. And so all of these evangelicals have been pushing on an open door on access to power, and they don't want to give that up.
Yeah, and I told someone the other day, here's a thought experiment that I really believe. If Trump were to say tomorrow, I'm pro-choice, I think Roe versus Wade was rightly decided. I've changed my mind and gone back to what I originally believed. I do not think he would lose a single supporter, because the older supporters would say, well, he's not as pro-choice as Joe Biden is. And the younger supporters would be posting memes about what losers unborn children are, ultimately. So he would be able to shift that almost completely without changing anything. So it's not a matter at this point of a set of ideas for which Trump is the vehicle. Trump is both the ideas and the vehicle.
In years past, I've heard stereotypical conservatives criticize stereotypical liberals as Chicken Little, the sky's falling, right? And it does, and in my own sort of processing of the last decade, I have this internal dialogue of how does one not fall prey to the sky's falling, while trying to look at the realities with a sober-minded realism. And how have you found a way forward in navigating those two needs?
Well, the problem we have right now is that there are many people for whom the roof has fallen in and it's on fire. And the response is, well, the sky has not fallen. And part of that is because we have adjusted at every point to things that would have shocked us previously and that we could not have imagined previously. And so I think the problem is not that there is too much alarm right now. I think the problem is that there's an adjustment to everything that one side is doing with a concentration to, but look at how much worse they are, and so therefore we have to be as bad as them. And that's one of the things that we had. Dave and I were both at an event where someone from the left was talking about political violence, and said one of the reasons January 6th was not a lot worse than it was is you didn't have the left then come in and start counter attacking in terms of left civilians. What if you had? And what happens when you have this conclusion? Well, the only way that we can fight political violence is with political violence. And that's a very scary reality. And I think the problem for us so far is there has been this, oh, that'll never happen, or something will happen and just end this. There'll be a great national emergency and we'll all unite together.
You mean like COVID?
Like COVID, which of course we saw how that worked out. So I think that's the primary problem. I think for those of us who are Christians, we have to take the message of Caesarea Philippi. Gates of hell will not prevail against the church. And so there is a long-term stability and future that's there. We can't be the people who yield to despair or to hopelessness. At the same time, the kind of wishing away what is happening is not only naive, it's actually not loving to neighbor.
You know, I'm going to read a quote from Al Mohler that I think absolutely encapsulates what we're dealing with. Say what you will about Donald Trump and his sex scandals, he doesn't confuse male and female. Now, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, he could have said, say what you will about Donald Trump and his sex scandals, he's pro-life, but you can't say that anymore. So what you're dealing with is a waving away of, by the way, just for the record, a jury finding of sex abuse, which, as Russell said, the judge had called the equivalent of rape, a jury finding of a finding of defamation against his sex abuse victim, hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud, and now a conviction where I think there are some legal issues that will be very important to resolve on appeal, but the factual background of the conviction is appalling. That he paid hush money to conceal a predatory affair or a predatory encounter with a porn star while right after his third wife had given birth to his youngest child. This is what they're waving away. But there's always an excuse. It's the left. Look at the left. But, at the end of the day, when you are putting forth a person who is this malicious, who is this destructive, who is this deceptive, who is all of the things that Donald Trump does, you are an instrument of harm, especially when that individual says, one of the things I'm going to do is go after all my political opponents. Then you're using the power that you have as a follower of Jesus Christ, and followers of Jesus Christ have a lot of power in this country. You're using that power as a form of punishment against your political opponents. Punishment. And many times when those political opponents just so happen to be raising factually correct issues with the Republican standard bearer. And it is just, it's just really hard for me to see Christ in any of that. And it's especially hard for me to see it when many of these same people, just think about Mohler himself and what he said about Donald Trump in 2016. And when many of these same people have, in years prior, drew the moral line in the sand. And then now, where is that line? And
it's not because the moral line has gotten better.
Right.
As a matter of fact, what we know about Trump now is far worse than any of us even imagined in 2016.
So much worse. I remember when I was moving from, hey, Trump is my last choice in the primary to I'm never voting for this guy ever. And it was sort of like a slow unveiling. And when I think back to the things that really pushed me over the edge to never Trumpism in late 2015, early 2016, it seems quaint. It's like 1/100th of what he actually ended up being and doing.
Two final last quick questions. One, it's common in peace resolution work, conflict resolution work, to distinguish positions from interests. Someone might have a position one sees as fundamentally horrific, but have an interest underneath that one can see as legitimate.
Right.
So when you're looking at those who are supporting Trump, are there interests there that you see as legitimate that could help broaden a space for constructive dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the issues that we have is it's a two-party system, and both parties are flawed. And so if you're in a position where, for example, Democratic policies have been particularly harmful to you or have failed in your community in a particular way, or there are elements of the Biden program, which there are many elements of Biden's program that I oppose, the natural instinct is to vote for the opponent of the president who's, responsible. If your family is more squeezed by inflation, for example, and you're frustrated by inflation, our system is designed that there's one recourse here. It is vote for that opposing party. And so I think if you browbeat Republicans into sort of saying it's not just that you need to support Donald Trump, it's that you also need to migrate on issue A, B, C, D, E, and F into some other camp. And because this Trumpism has to be just crushed completely, and then in that migration, you end up empowering a lot of policies you don't like. I wish people would understand that puts folks in a difficult position. And this is something that I get to all the time with my friends in Blue America. You have no idea of the different knowledge set that exists in parts of Red America. The polls are astounding at the low level of knowledge of Trump scandals amongst Republican Americans. So on the one hand, you have every Democratic scandal is hyped. It's horrible. It's terrible. It's going to destroy America. Every Trump scandal is either minimized or rationalized or ignored entirely. And so you have these people with these two different information sets, and it creates, so I have enormous sympathy for folks in that circumstance. Where my sympathy runs out is in the chattering classes. These are the people who know good and well what Trump does. They know good and well who Trump is. And then they start browbeating followers of Jesus into supporting Donald Trump. So I have a huge amount of compassion for, say, that the older woman at my church who came up to me one day and said, "David, why don't you support Donald Trump?" And I responded very, gently, I just wish he lied less. And with dripping sincerity says, he lies? Just didn't cross her mind, versus that Al Mohler quote of say what you will about his sex scandals. Yeah. And I think we have to realize that not everyone is going in here with eyes wide open, knowing everything that Trump has done and saying, support him anyway.
Yeah, that's true. And I think a lot of people are still operating under the old political binaries that don't exist right now.
Yeah.
And so right now, what you have is not the question of right versus left as much as you do the question of democracy versus authoritarianism.
Yep.
And when that's the case, that means that, and David and I both have said similar things to people who are trying to bring together a pro-democracy movement of right, center, and left, and say, look, if you actually want conservatives and evangelicals who care about democracy and who care about norms, you can't ask them to declare their pronouns when they walk in the room.
Right.
You have to understand we do have these differences, and we are going to continue to have these differences. And what we're not doing is saying, let's not argue about these things, saying, let's get through this crisis so that we can argue about these things under democratic, small d, democratic, small r, Republican norms.
Yeah. So last question, what kind of concrete, practical advice would you give to people who don't have a platform, may not even be deeply engaged in knowing what all's going on? What would you say you would wish more people in that majority you talked about early, David, would do?
That's a very good question. One thing is I do want people to, and I actually had a real heart-to-heart about this with some friends of mine recently, because after I got canceled from being a panelist at the Presbyterian Church in America's General Assembly, just amidst of a avalanche of lies, malicious attacks, etc., and the denomination just caved almost instantaneously. And so I was talking to some good friends of mine, and I said, look, we can't, no one of us can fix our country ourselves, but all of us are in institutions. All of us belong to a local church. I'm talking to Christians here. We all belong to a local church. We all are part of different Christian institutions. And we can take responsibility for the health of that institution that we're a part of. And so don't be the person who is standing aside silently while some people in your congregation are being bullied out the door.
Yeah.
Don't stand aside. Don't just let it happen and say, it's not my business that the pastor is under siege from a small, angry group of people who want him to start talking about the elections being stolen. Take responsibility. Don't do the Homer Simpson thing where the eyes wide, you back into the shrubbery and you just forget about it. But also don't do too much of an ask. Don't sit there and say, well, now you have to totally become this kind of political activist that you've never been in your life before. I do think people need a heightened awareness of where we are and to vote accordingly. But at the same time, we need people to take responsibility for the institutions that they're a part of. Go back to that, the Second Coming poem. The best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passion and intensity. You need conviction. You need intensity to defend the integrity of these institutions.
And it's not just that they're silent when people are bullied. A lot of people actually then become angry at the one who is bullied.
Yes.
Why are you so controversial that they had to bully you?
Yeah.
I mean, that is a toxic dynamic if we saw it in a family. It's a toxic dynamic when we see it in a church or a denomination or in a country. And so sometimes when people say, well, what do I do? What they want is a checklist. Here are the ways you can do this, this, and this, and we have all of this fixed by November. That is not possible. It's not so much a way of doing as it is a way of being. You can say, I can't change the entire world. I can't change the entire country. I can't change my political party. I can't change my church. What I can do is change myself, and I can resist being absorbed into and to normalize things that just aren't right or normal.
I'll give you a good example. So Nancy did an investigation. I came alongside later, but she did heroic, award-winning journalistic work to expose just one of the most grotesque cover-ups of sex abuse in the church that I've ever heard of. And this was the Kanakuk camps. Decades, she uncovered decades of sex abuse at one of the most powerful and wealthy Christian camps in the country. And what was remarkable to me was outside of the very small this community of survivors who were overwhelmingly grateful that their story was finally being told, a lot of people treated this revelation as an annoyance. Mm-hmm. Wait, does that mean I have to rethink where my kid goes to summer camp? I'm not going to do that. My kid likes that camp. And so what we have seen is there's an exposure of how little people are willing to sacrifice, to uphold some really cardinal values and cardinal virtues. Wait, you want me to mean what I say about political integrity? Well, that might mean that there's a presidential race lost. Can't have that, and those are some of the biggest stakes, but you're in any given individual vote, you can't track to that. But think about the summer camp example. What are you really giving up if you say, you know what, I'm not going to send my kid to a summer camp until I can trust that they're not going to cover up sex abuse. And then they're not going to try to silence and intimidate victims. That's not a big ask, but apparently it is. And so this is what I mean when I talk about taking responsibility for the institutions that you belong to. Instead of being instinctively defensive, be instinctively justice-minded and think about, wait, is this critique accurate? Is there an actual real problem here? And so, that's what's discouraging is how little effort people are willing to undertake that would cause them any inconvenience or any sort of sense of adversity to uphold some of these really cardinal values and virtues that I thought the church.
Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter.
Which it always stood for.
I'm talking to David French, opinion columnist for the New York Times, Russell Moore, editor-in-chief, Christianity Today. Grateful for y'all's generosity with your time today and the work you're doing and the conversation today.
Thank you. Loves No Small Endeavor.
Thank you.
Honored to be here.
Thank you.
And Lee, it's always great to see you. And I think back to our days in Omega Nu.
Yeah. Great to see you both. Thank you. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriot Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.